dedicated my professional life to helping tackle the world's biggest environmental issues. And I believe, despite how the present may seem, that there are many reasons to be hopeful about the future. It's my goal that by the end of this talk, you will see why that is the case and be inspired to help bring change. September of 2019 marked the beginning of another brush fire season in Australia. It began uneventfully, but just 5 months later, the fires had burned over 42 million acres, destroyed thousands of structures, killed over 1 billion animals, yes, that's billion with a B, and at least 33 people. For context, the area covered by the fires was 10,000 times larger than the blast size of the atomic bomb the United States dropped on Hiroshima at the end of World War II. Imagine 10,000 atomic bombs exploding across Australia. That is how widespread the blazes were. And across the world, happening right now at this very moment, is another environmental disaster. Lake Mead is the largest water reservoir in the United States, but decades of severe drought and mismanagement have caused it to be less than 150 feet from becoming a dead pool, where the water level is so low it can no longer flow downstream. This has a distinct possibility of happening in the coming years, and will have, if it occurs, enormous and dire consequences for millions of people across the southwestern United States and Mexico. Now, these two problems may appear completely unrelated, but they are in fact deeply connected. Both of them were amplified by the effects of man-made climate change on our world. Climate change is big. Climate change is scary. It's easy to feel like we are powerless to stop it. There's even a phenomenon called climate doomism, where people lose all hope that humanity is capable of enduring the effects of climate change. It's absolutely true that climate change is perhaps the biggest and most complex problem humanity has ever faced. It's equally true that we are currently not doing enough to address it. But that does not mean that it's impossible for us to overcome, and that does not mean that there's nothing that we, as ordinary people, can do. At this point, some of you may be wondering, what is climate change? How does it work? Climate change is defined by the United Nations as the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. Over the course of Earth's history, climate change had always very slowly occurred, gradually, over many thousands of years at a time. But since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 150 years ago, the rate of climate change has greatly accelerated due to the emission of certain gases called greenhouse gases through human activities. These gases, such as carbon dioxide or methane, trap heat inside the atmosphere, leading to warmer average temperatures. If you want a good analogy of how climate change works, think of a time when you've gotten inside your car on a hot summer day. It's warmer inside your car than outside, isn't it? I'm sure everyone here in Sherman can relate to this feeling. This is because the glass lets the sunlight through, but keeps the heat trapped inside, just like how greenhouse gases let sunlight through into Earth's atmosphere and keep the heat trapped inside. And while warmer average temperatures don't sound very serious, climate change is very dangerous because of how interconnected the climate is with nature. Warmer temperatures are making the polar ice caps melt, causing sea levels to rise. This might mean that island nations or coastal areas will need to be evacuated or abandoned. Droughts, like the one affecting Lake Mead, are longer lasting and more severe. Even hurricanes and typhoons are, on average, stronger and larger than before, because warmer sea temperatures are feeding these storms as they travel through the ocean. It sounds overwhelming, but humanity has overcome many environmental disasters before. Simple things that a lot of us take for granted, like clean air or water, used to be flashpoint environmental issues. We found solutions for those. Why can't we do the same for climate change? Why can't we learn to adapt to these shifts in temperatures and weather patterns? Let me give you some examples of some problems we've overcome in the past. On December 5th, 1952, a fog rolled into London, England. It's not terribly surprising to hear, I'm sure, but this was no natural fog. This was a toxic stew of industrial emissions and pollutants kept low to the ground by a high-pressure weather system. In some parts of the city, people walking on the streets couldn't see their own feet. Drivers abandoned cars on the roads, and hospitals faced a rush of emergency visits. By the time the now called Great Smog of London lifted 4 days later, over 4,000 people had died, and modern estimates suggest this could be even closer to 10,000. But the real kicker is this had been a problem since the 13th century. Toxic smog leading to fatalities had been a problem in London for over 700 years. But the Great Smog of London finally pushed the British government to create their version of the Clean Air Act. This established smoke-free areas, limited coal burning for industrial and domestic use, and made grants available for homeowners to change heating sources to cleaner fuel sources. Today, because of this law and other changes like it, London no longer routinely faces serious smog incidents. There's still air quality problems, but they're often of a different nature, and a 700-year-old problem was overcome. Let me give you another example. The Cuyahoga River runs through the heart of Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland is a city founded on industry and manufacturing. The Cuyahoga River runs through Cleveland into the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which today supports a diverse ecosystem of many different plants and animals. But it was not always that way. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River looked very different. The surface bubbled from the amount of chemicals that had been dumped into the river. It was covered in oil slicks and trash, and the bodies of rats that floated down the river were so bloated they were the size of dogs. Yeah. And on June 22nd of 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. The blaze lasted for 30 minutes and caused about $50,000 in damages to the city. But the real kicker is this was not the first time this had happened. Not even close. From 1868 to 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire at least 10 different times. And it's quite possible there are incidents that we are not aware of. Some of these blazes caused millions of dollars in damages and led to fatalities. I want to take a moment to pause my talk and make sure the insanity of what I'm telling you is clear. A river caught on fire and did so multiple times. Fortunately, the last blaze in 1969 helped kickstart a push for regulation and cemented the newly created Environmental Protection Agency's role in safeguarding America's ecosystems. The Cuyahoga River still has problems, but you don't see it catching on fire anymore now, do you? In both of these cases, a chronic, complex, and dangerous environmental problem was overcome thanks in large part to the will of the people. And that's what I want you to take away from these examples. Even the biggest problems, with decades or centuries of buildup, can be overcome with enough support. I think we could do the same for climate change. In fact, in some ways, the world has already started to take its first tentative steps. In 2015, representatives from 196 countries, industries, and environmental groups met in Paris, France. Their goal was to create a binding international treaty that would limit the temperature increase from climate change to be no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution levels. This is very important because it's believed if we go too far above this mark, the effects of climate change can and will spiral out of control. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2016, and in 2021, the 26th Conference of the Parties, a meeting of the United Nations, reviewed the progress made. Unfortunately, it seems that we are on track for a 2.7 degrees Celsius shift, well above what would be considered safe. The Paris Agreement, however, was still groundbreaking in many ways. It was the first international treaty to commit to reducing the use of coal, which is perhaps the dirtiest fuel source when it comes to fossil fuel emissions and pollution. It mobilized millions of dollars to change economic practices and established funds for nations that need assistance in dealing with climate change. While the Paris Agreement and follow-up conferences are victories, it's absolutely true that they are not enough. Not yet, anyway. But believe it or not, the entire world has successfully united around an environmental disaster before. Many of us probably take refrigeration and air conditioning for granted as convenient modern-day tools. But what you might not know is that some of the chemicals first used in these processes, called chlorofluorocarbons, by the way, try to say that 5 times fast to yourself, destroy the ozone layer. This is bad because the ozone layer, also located in the atmosphere, protects us from solar radiation and ultraviolet light. When AC and refrigeration were first created, chlorofluorocarbons were constantly leaking into the atmosphere, thinning it to a dangerous degree and creating many holes, as it's often called. This led to millions of cases of melanoma, skin cancer, and eye cataracts for people all around the world. Fortunately for us, this changed in 1987 when the United Nations convened and established the Montreal Protocol. This treaty gradually but forcefully phased out the use of chlorofluorocarbons. Today, because of it, it's predicted that the previous damage done to the atmosphere and the ozone layer will be undone in the coming decades, likely even within my lifetime. So the world can unite around an environmental disaster, and it has done so before, successfully. It's absolutely true that climate change is much more complex than a single series of chemicals destroying the ozone layer, but that does not mean that it's impossible. We need to amplify our voices and tell our governments, leaders, and businesses we will not give them a pass when it comes to the future. It is our future. It's the planet's future. It's the future for everybody who is yet to be born. Let's not let it go to waste. But what now? What do we, as ordinary people, do? It's easy to feel like the future is out of our hands. And I admit in some ways it is. But that does not mean that there is nothing you can do. Make art to raise awareness. Become a political activist. Research. Go into environmental law. Be the technician who installs solar panels or wind turbines. But even if you don't want to make the environment your career path, I think there are still actions that many of us can take. The first, and I think the most important thing to do, is vote. If you live in a democracy, you have the power to make a difference directly. Review the environmental stances your candidates take and vote with a future on a planet with climate change in mind. Tell them you're watching how they act and what they support, and hold them accountable. Change can come through the system, even if it doesn't always feel like it. The next thing I would do is get involved. This is especially helpful if you feel like things are hopeless or that you are powerless because you are directly working to make a difference. And you might be surprised by the difference you can make. I certainly was. Last year, I joined a volunteer team in Colorado that was trying to convince the State Public Utilities Commission to close down a coal plant 40 years earlier than the owners originally intended. Not only was this coal plant creating literal tons of greenhouse gases every year, it was spewing pollution into the local community because it was full of bad and outdated equipment. And you know what? We succeeded. Imagine how much, thank you. Imagine how much pollution and how many greenhouse gases are created by a coal plant in 40 years. We helped prevent that from happening. Now, did my individual contributions mean much? No. But together, did my team's efforts make an impact? Yes. And so did the efforts of other organizations and teams working alongside us. If you feel like you are powerless, remember that it's by working together that change is made. You can do more than you think because you aren't working alone. Next, act like your choices matter, because they do. And I'm going to put a big disclaimer on this statement first. If you are struggling to make ends meet, do what you need to do. If you are overwhelmed with school, work, personal trauma, or emergencies, focus on taking care of your immediate situation. But if you have the time, and I think many of us do, and you have the capability, again, I think many of us do, then you can make differences in your lifestyle that will add up on a personal level. And that might be worth more than you think. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Nations, the OECD, are the nations generally thought of as being as Western or Westernized. They make up 1/6 of the world's population, but despite that relatively small number, they use 1/3 of the energy, 1/2 of the electricity, and create 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. The little things may not mean much to you, but when your environmental impact is many times larger than almost everyone else's, it makes a big difference in the end. And the United States has the biggest share in the OECD when it comes to those metrics. Start small. More and more businesses are going hybrid or remote for work than ever before. Even if you stay at home and work in your home office once or twice a week, that cuts out your commute time. There's less stress on you from being stuck into rush hour traffic, less air pollution for your local community, fewer greenhouse gases being put into the atmosphere. Do you remember how clean the air was in some cities during COVID? It can't happen. Or take out something that you do regularly without thinking about it. Eat meat once or twice a day instead of at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Fossil fuel and resource reserves are finite, and they will run out before humanity does. We have to make sure the effects of what we create and what we consume don't outlast us. Lastly, educate yourself. Think critically. See what's happening in the world, and whatever goes on, good or bad, motivate you to always strive for better. And that's important because the future is messy. The future is complex. The future is hard to have faith in. There are many times while I was writing this speech that I felt like I was lying to you guys, that this wasn't true. But I stuck with it. And even though there are many barriers in the way of real progress, like vested interests lobbying against change, attacks on science and democracy, social distrust dividing not only the United States, but the whole world, greed and an urge for profit being placed before justice and progress, and misinformation and propaganda spreading lies, doubts, and fear, I believe that there is hope. I believe that hope is not something you should believe in. Hope is something you become. Thank you.